They once filled backyard gardens and Sunday tables. Vibrant, hardy vegetables now buried by time and supermarket sameness. Why did we abandon what once fed us best, and what are we really missing with every lost harvest? Chufa, known by many old farmers as groundnuts or tiger nuts, once blanketed southern fields like quiet rows of memory. These tiny nutty tubers were not flashy, but they were dependable, resilient in poor soil, rich in flavor, and harvested with a sense of pride that echoed through generations. Dried, roasted, or ground into flour, chufa offered protein when money was scarce and grew even when the rains did not come. Farmers used them to fatten hogs. Children chewed on them like candy, and grandmothers baked them into holiday pies that disappeared by dusk. But then, somewhere along the way, we left them behind. Supermarket peanuts and commercial farming pushed them to the fringe. Today, chufa hides mostly in the wild, tangled in memories and overlooked in the rows of processed snacks. As it turns out, the next one had the texture of a carrot and a flavor that fooled even the pickiest eater, especially when it pretended to be seafood. Salsify, also called the oyster plant, was the root vegetable that tricked everyone, because when you cooked it just right, it tasted like shellfish pulled fresh from the coast. In the 1940s, it was a household favorite. Long, slender roots that peeled like parsnips and cooked into creamy, subtle perfection. You would boil it, mash it, roast it in butter, or slip it into chowders that passed as seafood feasts during meatless weeks. For working-class kitchens, it was luxury on a budget. It did not shout or demand attention. It simply delivered again and again. Its mild, briny flavor made it feel special, like something rare even when it was not. But as tastes changed and food trends leaned toward flashier imports and instant meals, salsify slowly vanished from the produce bin. And if that root was subtle, the next one was bold, big, hearty, and too humble for modern grocery aisles. Mangelwurzel was not pretty. It was not dainty. But this hefty root, shaped like an overgrown beet and rough around the edges, helped keep American farms fed through hard winters and lean decades. It was a dual-purpose miracle. Livestock ate it raw, sliced into troughs with muddy hands and hard blades, while farm families boiled it down into thick stews, rough purees, or even fermented pickles. Rich in calories and hardy in the soil, Mangelwurzel did not need pampering. It grew big, it grew fast, and it grew in dirt that had given up on everything else. Some families roasted it with onions, others mashed it with vinegar. A few even made a rudimentary beer from it, bitter, brassy, and strong enough to knock you back a step. But somewhere between survival and convenience, we traded it away. Maybe it was the name. And for every vegetable that fed your body, there was one that reminded you to slow down, thorny, beautiful, and made for patience. Cardoon looked like it belonged in a bouquet, not a stew pot. With stalks like celery and leaves that could slice your hand, it was the sort of vegetable that made you earn your dinner. But for immigrant families and victory garden enthusiasts, Cardoons were pure gold. They were chopped, boiled, fried, and stewed until tender, layered into casseroles, dunked in batter, or simmered in sauces passed down for generations. The flavor was earthy, slightly bitter, and kissed with artichoke. In Italian kitchens, Cardoon meant celebration. In wartime America, it meant resourcefulness. And in every bite, there was tradition. It was not quick food. It was not easy food. But that was the point. Growing Cardoon took space. Preparing it took effort. But it forced families to slow down, to gather, to cook together. And when the world sped up, when frozen vegetables and microwave ovens arrived, Cardoon quietly disappeared from the backyard rows. Now it is mostly forgotten, except in rare seed catalogs and family stories told over fading recipe cards. But its story still lives, and so does its crunch, mirrored in another forgotten plant that once crackled between your teeth like a vegetable from outer space. Crosnes, sometimes called Chinese artichokes, looked like something dreamed up by a curious child. Tiny, coiled like seashells, and no bigger than your pinky, these tubers were delicate and crunchy, with a snap that echoed in every bite. In the 1950s and 60s, they were a secret weapon in holiday cooking, served buttered, sautéed, or lightly pickled on special occasion tables. Their flavor was nutty, somewhere between a water chestnut and a sunchoke, but their texture was the real show. They felt like biting into time itself, crisp, light, and strangely elegant. Crosnes were pushed aside by easier crops and plastic-packaged convenience. But the memory lingers, in old French cookbooks, in grandmother's stories, and in the longing for a time when vegetables could still surprise you. And if Crosnes were a treat for the curious, the next vegetable was built for the hard times, filling, dependable, and quietly packed with history. Cowpeas were more than just black-eyed peas. They were a lifeline during the Depression and a proud fixture in southern kitchens long before food came in cans. You could grow them in worn-out soil where other crops failed. They did not need pampering, just heat, sun, and time. People boiled them, stewed them, mashed them with onions and fatback, or folded them into skillet cornbread when flour was running low. They were cheap, filling, and packed with protein. But what made cowpeas special was how they connected generations. Grandmothers saved seeds in envelopes. Fathers turned soil before sunrise. Kids shelled the pods on porches, fingers stained and stories shared, still quietly carrying the flavor of survival. And if you thought cowpeas were humble, wait until you meet the dark, earthy root that pulled families through another kind of war, quietly feeding a nation from underneath the frostbitten soil. Scorzonera, also known as black salsify, was the wartime root vegetable that made a surprisingly elegant plate during rough years. With its jet-black skin and creamy white flesh, it resembled a stick pulled from a coal pile. But once peeled and cooked, it turned buttery, smooth, and delicately sweet. Families in the 1940s tucked it into victory gardens when potatoes ran low and carrots dried out. It was easy to store, easy to grow, and dependable through harsh weather. Boiled, mashed, or roasted, Scorzonera fed families without flair, but with comfort. It was one of those foods that hid in plain sight, filling bellies without making headlines. Today, it lives mostly in old gardening books and forgotten seed drawers. But its taste lingers for those who remember. Soft, earthy, and exactly what you needed when options were few. And for every sturdy root crop, there was one that brought sweetness, not from sugar, but from a past where even the soil seemed to remember how to be kind. Skirret was once the sweet treat of colonial root sellers before sugarcane ruled the world and before corn syrup had a lobby. This tall, flowering plant grew clusters of thin white roots that tasted like a blend of carrot, parsnip, and sugar. It was sweet enough to roast for dessert, yet hearty enough to stir into a stew. Early American homesteads prized it not just for flavor, but for its dependability. You could leave it in the ground all winter and still dig it up come spring. You could mash it, fry it, boil it, or dry it for later. Some families even candied it like ginger. But skirret did not do well in modern farm rows. It was too delicate, too time-consuming, and too easy to forget. Slowly, as refined sugar became more available, this old root fell out of favor. But for a time, it brought sweetness to the poor, to the practical, and to those who knew the value of coaxing flavor from the ground itself. And while skirret sweetened the past, the next plant filled coffee cups, wartime plates, and dinnertime stories, sometimes all in the same day. Chicory root was the uninvited guest that stayed long enough to become family. When coffee was scarce, during wars, blockades, or just hard times, chicory root stepped in. Dried, roasted, and ground, it brewed a bitter, earthy cup that kept people going when the real beans were gone. It was more than a substitute. Even today, you will find it in parts of Louisiana and the South, where tradition and necessity still walk hand in hand. Chicory reminded everyone that taste does not always come easy, but it can be made. And once something proves it can stand in for what you lost, you never quite forget it. But while chicory stood strong in lean years, the next forgotten crop was zesty, vibrant, and hiding in backyard gardens long before salsa had its own aisle. Tomatillos once grew like weeds, vining out behind sheds, popping up in kitchen gardens, and getting tossed into stews long before anyone called it cuisine. These little green globes and papery husks were more than side ingredients. They were staples. Farmers and homesteaders simmered them down into tart sauces, added them to beans, or pickled them for tangy snacks when the winter came in hard. The taste was unmistakable, sharp, citrusy, and a little wild. Tomatillos gave flavor to otherwise bland dishes, especially in homes that stretched one chicken over 3 meals. Today, they are coming back, but slowly, and mostly as novelty. But ask anyone who remembers and they will tell you, this little fruit brought brightness to even the dullest days. And as we look back on the crops that fed us, there is one more you might never have heard of, but it may have been the toughest seed ever planted in the American Southwest. Tepary beans were not just a crop, they were a survival tool. Long before drought-resistant seeds were engineered in laboratories, these humble beans were feeding families in the arid Southwest with little more than sunlight and grit. Native to the region and cherished by indigenous communities for centuries, Tepary beans thrived where other crops shriveled. Their small size packed a surprising punch, high in protein, fiber, and resilience. During the Dust Bowl years and World War rationing, these beans earned their place at the table once again. Farmers who had nearly given up on planting found that Tepary beans could endure heat, poor soil, and long dry spells, and still feed a family. Today, they are almost forgotten outside of seed catalogs and heirloom farmers markets. But when you bite into a bowl of Tepary chili or bean salad, you are tasting not just food, but history, cooked low and slow by survival. And if one dessert plant could hold off hunger, just imagine what the next forgotten crop once brought to America's coasts. Sea kale once thrived along the wind-whipped edges of coastal farms. Its waxy leaves, tinged with silver and salt, sprouted like gifts from the sand. In the 19th century, it was a delicacy, harvested in seaside gardens from Maine to the Carolinas, bundled and sold fresh to hungry market towns. Sea kale was rich in minerals, hardy against salt spray, and packed with flavor that sat somewhere between asparagus and broccoli. You could boil it, roast it, or sauté it in butter until the stems turned sweet and tender. In springtime, its tender shoots were as prized as green beans. But as the 20th century rolled in, sea kale faded. Commercial agriculture demanded uniformity, and sea kale was stubborn. It thrived on coastlines, not in rows. It did not ship well, and so it was replaced by easier crops. But sea kale fed seaside families and enriched soil where few other crops would take root. It was more than a vegetable. It was a survival tactic on cliffs and dunes. And while sea kale hugged the coast, a very different kind of tuber dug deep in the woods, quietly feeding entire nations long before the word organic existed. Hopniss, also known as the American groundnut, was the superfood before anyone coined the word. It grew wild along streams and forest edges, feeding indigenous communities for generations. This climbing vine produced small, knobby tubers underground, rich in protein, sweeter than potatoes, and easy to preserve. Colonists learned about it from native farmers, and for a time it became a lifeline. Boiled, roasted, or mashed, Hopniss nourished early Americans through lean winters and empty cupboards. The plant fixed nitrogen in the soil. It thrived without chemicals. It gave back more than it took, but it never made it into the glossy seed catalogs. It grew slowly, it looked humble, and its true value could not be rushed. Over time, Hopniss was edged out by faster, cheaper starches, but those who remember it speak of it with reverence, a forgotten food that gave quietly. That sustained without flash. And like the parsnip, which once reigned in the root cellars of every American farm, its story has nearly vanished from modern plates. Parsnips used to be royalty in the American root cellar. Before sugar was cheap and carrots were sweetened for the supermarket aisle, parsnips were the go-to. Their flavor deepens after frost, turning earthy, nutty, and just sweet enough to make children smile in a stew. In colonial times, they were mashed into cakes, roasted alongside meats, and even fermented into wine. They were not just hardy, they were versatile. And farmers loved them because they grew big, lasted long, and gave the land a break. But then came the carrot, flashier, more colorful, easier to slice into lunchboxes. By the 1950s, parsnips were cast as old-fashioned, grandparent food. And slowly, they faded. A time when flavor came from patience and winter meals started underground. And for every old root that softened in the stew pot, there was one herb-like giant that once stood tall in farm gardens, flavoring meals with forgotten strength. Lovage was the leafy backbone of farmhouse kitchens. Imagine celery, stronger, more fragrant, and growing over 6 feet tall. That was lovage. With its hollow stalks and dark green leaves, it grew like a weed and flavored like a wonder. Tossed into soups, stews, and roasts, it added a deep herbal note that turned simple meals into something memorable. Farmers used every part: leaves for broth, stems for straws, seeds for spice, and roots as medicinal tea. It grew with little care, it lasted for years, and once you planted it, it rarely left. But as packaged seasonings took over, lovage was left behind. It was too bold, too old world. And slowly, it disappeared from garden rows and grocery shelves. Yet it lingered in the margins, among herbalists, heirloom seed savers, and cooks who knew that some flavors are worth chasing. Lovage gave food a whisper of memory, of cellars, root soups, and cast-iron pots on farmhouse stoves. And while lovage whispered, the next vegetable once shouted from every pot of stew in the 1930s before fading quietly into the shadows of supermarket aisles. Rutabagas were once the quiet champion of American stews, especially during the long, lean years of the 1930s. This hardy, thick-skinned root was a staple in farm kitchens from Maine to Missouri. It was cheap, filling, and stored through brutal winters when little else could survive. In those days, a pot of stew was not complete without chunky cubes of rutabaga, turning tender and buttery as they simmered next to carrots, onions, and whatever meat could be spared. It was not glamorous, it was not pretty, but it was dependable. Rutabagas gave flavor when resources ran thin, and their sweet, earthy bite turned desperation meals into comfort food. As times improved, rutabagas slowly drifted to the back corners of produce aisles, overshadowed by shinier, easier vegetables. Fewer families bothered to plant them. Fewer recipes bothered to include them. But for those who remember, rutabagas still carry the taste of survival, grit, and kitchens that made something from almost nothing. And while rutabagas anchored the stew pot, a different kind of tuber, nutty and sweet, once thrived quietly in backyard gardens across the Midwest. Jerusalem artichokes, also known as sunchokes, were the sweet, knobby tubers that old Midwest farmers once dug up by the bushel. Despite the name, they are not from Jerusalem, and they are not related to artichokes. They are the roots of a sunflower cousin, earthy, nutty, and crisp when raw, creamy when roasted. Families grew them because they were almost impossible to kill. Plant a few, and they multiplied. Leave them untended, and they thrived anyway. They became a hidden pantry underground, offering up food when corn or beans failed. Sunchokes found their way into soups, casseroles, and dinner plates, especially in hard times when you needed something hearty that cost nothing. Over time, they fell out of fashion. Their odd, bumpy shapes did not fit into modern produce bins. Their strong flavor was labeled weird instead of wonderful. Yet old-timers still talk about them with a kind of fondness, a forgotten feast growing quietly just below the surface. And while sunchokes hid underground, another surprising crop grew right underfoot, one many today would mistake for an unwanted weed. Purslane was the tangy, succulent weed that grandparents once picked on purpose. It crept low across backyard gardens and along gravel roads with thick green leaves that glistened under the summer sun. Today, it is often yanked out and tossed aside, but there was a time when purslane was prized. It was juicy, peppery, and packed with more omega-3 fatty acids than most vegetables. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing, when grocery store produce was a luxury, purslane was a gift. Grandmothers tossed it into salads, stews, and omelets. Farmers' wives pickled it to brighten winter meals. Kids were sent out with baskets to gather it before supper. It needed no planting, no tending, only noticing. That was supper. And if Purslane crawled close to the ground, another Depression-era favorite reached upward, marching across gardens all on its own. Walking onions sound like something from a fairy tale, but they were a hard truth in Depression-era gardens. Also called Egyptian onions, these hardy plants grew little clusters of tiny bulbs at the top of their stalks. As the bulbs grew heavier, the stalk bent, touching the ground, and wherever it touched, a new onion took root. They literally walked across gardens, self-planting their way into food security. Farmers and homesteaders loved them because they needed almost no maintenance, no reseeding, no careful tending. You harvested some, left the rest, and next year, you had more. Walking onions provided fresh greens in early spring when nothing else was ready. They flavored stews, biscuits, and broths at a time when every bite mattered. They were reliable, they were stubborn, and slowly they disappeared as grocery stores replaced backyard ingenuity. But once, in lean times, they were a silent promise that something green would always come back. And if these onions could crawl their way into survival, another forgotten green once carpeted California's gold country, saving hungry settlers when hope ran thin. Miner's lettuce was the emerald gem of the American gold rush. Amid the dust, danger, and deprivation, this delicate, crunchy green sprouted like a miracle along shaded hillsides and creek beds. Prospectors and settlers quickly learned to trust its tender, cupped leaves for nutrition, especially after long, lean winters left them desperate for fresh food. Rich in vitamin C, miner's lettuce staved off scurvy and filled empty bellies when supplies were weeks away. It grew wild, plentiful, and forgiving, requiring nothing but a little shade and a little rain. Settlers would gather it by the handfuls, tossing it into simple salads or eating it straight from the earth. It tasted clean, bright, alive. A reminder that even in a brutal and hungry landscape, the land could still offer a gift. But as towns grew and farming changed, miner's lettuce was forgotten, replaced by store-bought greens flown in from distant fields. Today, it survives mainly in specialty farmers markets and whispered memories of a wilder, hungrier time. And while miner's lettuce saved the West, another humble root once graced the tables of early America, prized not for its leaves, but for what grew beneath the soil. Hamburg root parsley was not grown for its leaves, it was grown for what it hid beneath the soil. Long before curly parsley became a restaurant garnish, farmers planted Hamburg root parsley for its thick, ivory-colored taproot. It looked like a cross between a carrot and a parsnip, and it was prized for its nutty, slightly sweet flavor. Cooks boiled it, roasted it, or sliced it into hearty stews, treating it more like a staple vegetable than a garnish. In early American kitchens, it was as common as potatoes, offering a steady source of vitamins through harsh winters. It grew quickly, stored easily, and survived cold snaps that killed off more delicate crops. Over time, as parsley leaves became fashionable and root vegetables fell out of favor, Hamburg root parsley faded quietly from gardens and plates. But in its prime, it was a humble hero. And if parsley once ruled the dirt, another plant climbed for the sky, bringing with it a taste of faraway lands. Yardlong beans sounded almost mythical, but these climbing wonders were very real, and once grew proudly in the back corners of farmers' markets. Unlike the stubby green beans more common today, Yardlong beans stretched nearly 3 feet long, winding around poles and fences like green serpents. Brought over from Asian farming traditions, these beans were prized for their tender texture and ability to thrive in scorching summer heat. American farmers who tried them found an almost magical harvest. More food, less fuss, and a rich, earthy flavor that made stews and stir-fries sing. Shoppers gawked at their ridiculous length, but the flavor kept people coming back for more. But while some vegetables climbed high, others simply thickened the pot, becoming the backbone of winter survival meals. Marrowfat peas were the quiet powerhouse of post-war winters. Grown large, plump, and starchy, these peas were harvested later than the sweet garden varieties, allowed to dry naturally in the pods. Their texture was thick, almost creamy when cooked, a far cry from the delicate green peas we know today. In the aftermath of war and rationing, Marrowfat peas became a staple in British and American homes alike. They found their way into thick, rib-sticking soups, hearty pot pies, and budget-friendly casseroles. A bag of dried marrowfats could feed a family for days with nothing more than water, salt, and maybe a bone for flavor. Their taste was deep and earthy, a reminder that luxury was not always about sweetness. It was about staying full. Marrowfat peas may have fallen out of fashion when fresher, flashier vegetables came along, but in lean times, they were gold. And if marrowfat peas made stews rich, another hidden treasure made the garden a sweeter, more magical place. Ground cherries were the sweet little secret hiding under leafy vines in grandmother's backyard garden. Wrapped in delicate paper lantern husks, these tiny golden fruits looked like something out of a fairy tale. You had to search for them, bending low, parting the leaves, plucking each one by feel. When you peeled back the papery skin, you found a burst of tangy sweetness, somewhere between a pineapple and a tomato. Ground cherries were not something you bought at the store. They were something you stumbled across, gathered in a basket, and snacked on while the afternoon sun dipped low. They found their way into pies, jams, and even homemade wines. Children loved them. Grandparents treasured them. They grew with little effort, reseeding themselves year after year, asking only for a patch of forgotten soil and a little patience. But if ground cherries were the sweet reward of slow living, the next forgotten vegetable was the wild green that saved entire families from going hungry. Lamb's quarters was the forager's answer to spinach long before grocery stores made greens convenient. Growing wild along fence rows, garden edges, and country fields, lamb's quarters was everywhere, and it was a blessing. Its dusty-looking leaves hid a rich, earthy flavor and a powerhouse of nutrients that rivaled any cultivated crop. Grandmothers plucked it by the handful, steaming it for supper or tossing it into soups and stews. When money was tight and seeds were few, lamb's quarters filled the dinner plate without costing a dime. It thrived in poor soil, survived droughts, and needed no tending. Some even called it wild spinach, though it tasted a bit heartier, a little more of the earth itself. In the days when every meal mattered and waste was not an option, lamb's quarters was not a weed, it was a miracle. But if lamb's quarters kept dinner green in hard times, the next forgotten vine gave families a climbing, thriving garden gift during the hottest months. Malabar spinach was not your average leafy green, and for grandparents who knew their way around a summer garden, it was pure gold. Unlike typical spinach that wilted under the heat, Malabar thrived when the sun was relentless and the soil cracked dry. It was a climbing, twisting vine with thick, glossy leaves that stayed tender and mild even in the dead heat of July. Families planted it by fences and trellises, letting it snake its way upward, offering not just food, but shade. Its leaves were slightly slippery when cooked, perfect for stews, sautés, and even sandwiches when lettuce bolted and bittered. Malabar spinach was a reliable, unglamorous hero that needed almost no pampering. And if Malabar was the star of the heat, okra had its own hidden history growing far beyond its southern stereotypes. Okra might get pegged today as a strictly southern staple, but back in the day, it thrived in Midwestern gardens just as proudly. Farmers and home gardeners in Ohio, Illinois, and even parts of Michigan grew rows of okra alongside tomatoes and sweet corn. It was cheap, hardy, and produced prolifically, with pods that could be stewed, fried, or sliced into soups that stretched a meal for a big family. The whole plant looked slightly alien, with spindly stalks and hibiscus-like flowers, but that did not matter once the harvest rolled in. Kids were sent out with baskets to snap the tender pods before they got too woody. Mothers battered and fried them into golden crunch or stirred them into thick gumbos that bubbled on the stovetop for hours. Okra's mucilaginous texture scared off no one back then. It was part of what made it perfect for hearty, filling stews. Somewhere along the way, it lost its place in northern gardens, but there was a time when okra was just as common as green beans. And for those looking for sharper, more daring flavors, Another forgotten green quietly ruled old-world kitchens. Sorrel was the tangy surprise that popped up in kitchen gardens long before lemons were a household staple. Its bright, lemony bite gave old-timey soups, sauces, and springtime dishes a sparkle that no other green could match. It grew quickly, required almost no care, and came back year after year like an old friend. Farm families prized it because it brought a punch of flavor to otherwise simple meals made from potatoes, beans, or boiled meats. You could simmer it into a creamy soup, stir it into a stew, or even toss the raw leaves into a salad to wake up tired winter palates desperate for anything fresh. Sorrel was not flashy, but it was dependable. It could turn a humble dish into something memorable without costing a cent extra. Grandparents who grew it knew that when the heavy meats of winter started to weigh heavy, sorrel offered a breath of spring. But if sorrel refreshed the palate, another vegetable boldly held the fort in wartime gardens across the country. Swiss chard was not a trendy superfood in the 1940s. It was a survival tool. Victory gardens sprung up in backyards, schoolyards, and vacant lots, and chard was one of the first vegetables planted. Why? Because it grew like a weed, produced leaves over and over again, and packed enough nutrients to keep families strong when ration books grew thin. Its crinkled leaves and vibrant stems made it a visual standout, but its real beauty was its resilience. People boiled it, sautéed it, chopped it into casseroles, and even pickled the stems when nothing else was left. In a time when no one could afford to waste food, Swiss chard delivered meal after meal, harvest after harvest. Grandmothers snipped it fresh for stews, while children learned to recognize its giant leaves poking up from the dirt. It was not glamorous, but it was vital. And when the first frosts threatened to end the harvest, another quiet hero stepped in to fill the gap and feed families long before refrigerators made fresh greens a year-round luxury. Claytonia, also called miner's lettuce, was the secret to staying green through the winter when everything else turned to frostbitten mush. Settlers during the California Gold Rush learned to survive on it, and later generations kept it alive in backyard gardens where every calorie mattered. It grew low to the ground with tiny round leaves and tender white blossoms, soaking up whatever little sun the cold months offered. Claytonia could be gathered fresh even in January, tucked into sandwiches, tossed into soups, or eaten straight by the handful when supplies ran low. It tasted crisp and slightly lemony, a burst of living flavor when winter meals leaned heavy on canned and dried goods. And while modern supermarkets offer lettuce year-round, few could match the thrill of finding something green and alive when the world outside seemed frozen stiff. Before European contact, a lot of Native American tribes had an incredible amount of access to wild tubers and roots. This was really true for potatoes, which had been domesticated in South America. They began to replace some root vegetables as a staple crop because of the sheer amount of utility. I mean, that's a cultural fact that holds true even now. Who can really deny the worth of a potato? Some days it feels like it's worth more than all the designers in your wardrobe. Native Americans also had an incredibly interesting way of preparing these potatoes. Frying them in bear fat is definitely something I haven't really thought of before. But then again, these people used to hunt bears semi-regularly, so I think we're on pretty different ends of the spectrum. The potatoes would be sliced and fried in bear fat on a flat stone over an open fire, and it would actually make for some extremely rich and crispy potatoes. Napolles and beans were staple foods for so many indigenous peoples. It's a bit surprising this recipe isn't a bit more well-known. Most of the more popular tribes like the Navajo and the Apache were regular consumers of this. In desert areas, prickly pear cactuses were one of the most valued plants because of their versatility, and a big part of that was the reasons we went over earlier when we talked about roasted cacti. Young cactus pads were usually preferred because they were a lot more rich in water content. The beans were a longer process though, and they're just as annoying today as they used to be back then. You had to really soak them thoroughly overnight. Now, once the nopales were cooked, they would be mixed with beans and simmered for even longer, so that the flavor would genuinely mesh well. Some tribes would add wild onions, mesquite pods, and chili peppers for a more well-rounded flavor profile. It was actually quite an amazing little dish. Nettle soup is a traditional dish that is actually made from the shoots of stinging nettles. This is a plant that was used by indigenous people across North America for several centuries, but it's also something that you would see in European and Asian traditions. Nettles, among the tribes, were valued for being a food source, but also for their fiber and medicinal benefits. Cherokee, Coast Salish, and Lakota tribes would often gather young nettles in the early spring when they were at the height of their nutritional value. It was something that became edible as soon as winter was over, which made it one of those crops you would want to stack up on immediately as soon as the winter was done. It would help to replenish vitamins, and it was just a very welcome taste, especially after months of eating salted, dried, and cured foods that had been preserved so they would last through the winter. Young stinging nettles would harvest quickly, so people wanted to get them before they did. Why though? Do they become inedible after flowering? Not really. They just develop oxalate crystals made out of calcium, which are just basically these granule-sized bits that aren't too pleasant to chew on. Buffalo chili with choke cherry sauce is one of those meals that grabs you by the collar and says, "Sit down, you are not going anywhere." It is rich, hearty, and absolutely unforgettable. You start with bison, leaner than beef, with a deeper flavor that comes from roaming open plains, not feedlots. Add beans, roasted peppers, maybe even a hint of smoked paprika if you want to cheat just a little. But the real magic? That comes from the choke cherry sauce. These wild little berries pack a punch, tart, slightly bitter, and perfectly balanced when you add a touch of honey or maple syrup. They were a staple for many Plains tribes and used in everything from pemmican to puddings. In this chili, they swirl into the broth like a sweet tart lightning bolt, cutting through the meatiness and elevating the entire dish. It is bold, it is ancestral, and it is delicious. This was the kind of meal shared at powwows and celebrations, hearty enough for warriors and warm enough for winter nights. But if this is a celebration of fire and depth, then next we are digging into something quiet and ancient. Bread made from oak trees, believe it or not. If you really want to do something for a big flat-out feast, though, there's just nothing better than some Native American-style spit-roasted turkey. Turkey was a major source of protein and food for indigenous peoples in the eastern woodlands. They had been used to preparing and handling turkey for generations. They even had the cleaning process down to a science. Also, the feathers of the bird were used for clothing, for arrows so that they would fly faster, and for rituals. I think they had some pretty good Thanksgiving ideas a long while before it even became a thing. If you wanted to recreate this today, you should ideally use a wild turkey, but even a domestic one works well. Also, smoked paprika and wild onions, plus the sage and thyme. I also suggest keeping it authentic and going with some bear fat or walnut oil if you can. You would need to set up a rotisserie spit over an open fire if you can. The end result is this deeply flavorful turkey that's got this wonderfully crispy exterior on the outside, but a smoky taste and tender feel on the inside. It's really just a delight for any kind of big gathering or party, and it's not a dish you want to be missing out on. Acorn squash was an incredibly popular cultivated vegetable among many different kinds of tribes. Squash in itself is something the Native Americans experimented with a fair amount. All of that effort eventually brought about the Three Sisters agricultural method, which was basically just growing crops of corn, beans, and squash together. The way they grew helped the other plants grow, so they were always grown together because the end result was more fantastic than if they were grown individually. Sweetening squash with maple syrup was also something that was popular among tribes who were centered around maple syrups, and I don't know if you know this, but tapping into maple trees for the syrup was a very common practice of the Native American peoples. They were arguably better at it than anyone else too, especially because of how much they valued maple syrup as a natural sweetener. Some tribes genuinely loved to have it without the syrup, though. They would slice it and dry the squash in the sun for long-term storage. Cholla buds with agave syrup were a desert superfood that originated all the way from the southwest. This is actually one of the few kinds of cactuses that are edible. They were known as the cholla cactus, and they were a plant that was native to the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. They were edible flower buds, and other southwestern tribes were known for harvesting and eating these buds for centuries. Among the tribes, the most notable ones were the Pima and Tohono O'odham tribes. The cholla buds were traditionally gathered by both during the start of spring, but they had to be carefully picked with sticks or tongs so that the spines of the cactus could be avoided. Next, they had to be roasted and dried, and they had a few flavors to offer, but it was mostly nutty notes and tangy tastes. That did make them versatile, though, especially when they were combined with agave syrup. It was something that was made from the agave plant and was used as a sweetener since way before Europeans ever stepped foot on American soil. This combination of agave syrup and the buds of the cholla cactus created a very earthy dish that had almost everything you needed. It wasn't overly sweet, and the syrup had a pretty low glycemic index, actually. The buds were very high in calcium. They were great for bone health, and one serving of them had more calcium than milk did. So, there's a reason they grew up so strong. There is something about mutton stew that makes time slow down. Maybe it is the way it simmers for hours, or the way the hominy swells up in the broth like it is soaking in every bit of flavor from the lamb, the onions, and the dried chilies. The Navajo people have been making this dish for longer than most cities have had streetlights, and they make it count. Mutton, if you have not had it, is deeper than your regular lamb. It is gamey in the best way, bold and rich. And when paired with the chewy texture of hominy, corn that has been nixtamalized for both nutrition and texture, you get something that feels substantial. You do not just eat this stew. You sit with it. You respect it. It feeds not just the body, but the memory of sheep herding on sunburnt mesas and cooking under stars brighter than anything electric. It is no frills, just flavor. You tear up some flatbread, scoop it up, and hope it never runs out. But if this was the heart of the desert, then what comes next is pure forest and lake, wild rice and maple, sweetened by the north winds. Buffalo and hominy soup is a bit of a unique one. I know that hominy is still something a lot of people prefer, definitely some UNCs and boomers, but also some people who just like retro, vintage, or cultural food. Buffalo meat is a bit harder to get than wild rice, though, and depending on where you live, this might not be a dish you're able to recreate, but I digress. You brown the buffalo meat in a pretty large pot, simmer the broth, add the hominy and seasonings, and just stir. Then you taste, test, and serve. It's a pretty easy recipe considering that the rest of the stuff on here does take some technical cooking skill, especially when it comes to the prep work. If you do decide to recreate this, you should honestly aim for making a winter dish out of it. That's how it was historically eaten back in the day for the Native American peoples as well, and that's because bison meat was really good at keeping you warm. Plus, this is just one of those soups that brings life back into you. Beaver tail soup was also a very prized dish, and beavers were actually a favorite among Native Americans. Corn husk-wrapped tamales have incredibly deep roots in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures. I know you might not really associate them with a lot of different ethnic groups, but it's genuinely something a lot of them have used throughout their history. There were specific tribes like the Pueblo and Hopi that had very agricultural lifestyles, and the Pueblo even had trade and cultural connections with Mesoamerican civilizations. They would share their knowledge with Mexican cultures, and in return, the Mexicans would share theirs. And that's how Native American tribes first became familiar with the idea of tamales. They were already very used to working with dried corn kernels and grounding them into masa. Also, these are a lot different from the typical tamales you might be used to because they usually rely on bison, venison, and rabbit. And each of those has its unique world of flavor different from the chicken and beef we're so used to on the corners of our streets. If you're looking for a fresh spin, try to hit up an authentic Native American joint or work with some venison or rabbit at home. You might be pretty surprised. Hogging an entire hog for yourself was a great hobby for Native Americans. What people would typically do with sunchokes, also known as wild sunflowers or earth apples, would be to mash them, roast them, and dry them. Some of these were done so that they could be preserved and used later on a rainy day, while some were so that they could be used with other kinds of recipes and foods. Sunchokes were cultivated by tribes like the Pawnee, Dakota, Ojibwe, and Iroquois. And unlike potatoes, sunchokes were a staple of the indigenous community a long time before there was anyone else but them roaming the land. They were a big part of how the community got inulin, which was a natural fiber that was really good for digestion. Sunchokes could also be eaten alone and mixed with other kinds of things such as nuts and herbs or corn. Sunchoke mash was something that would be harvested in the fall and winter, and it was one of the few sources of sweetness that people had left to them. The water and broth would be used to make the tubers softer, and the bear fat, or buffalo tallow, was added in to make them overall more rich. The sage, wild garlic, and jumper berries were often the final touch in this dish, giving the mash that herbal aroma it was missing. Hopi piki bread might be the most delicate piece of cooking you will ever witness. This is not your average flatbread. It is whisper thin, paper light, and made from blue cornmeal mixed with water and a touch of ash. But here is the catch. There is no pan, no oven, and no room for error. The batter is hand-smoothed in a single stroke across a burning hot stone, and within seconds, it sets. You peel it off like parchment. It is soft but strong, flexible like rice paper, and every sheet is layered with care. For the Hopi people, making piki is a rite of passage, a skill taught slowly over years and passed from mother to daughter, generation to generation. It is food you handle with reverence, not just because of how hard it is to make, but because of how much history it holds. Eating it is like tasting memory itself. And if you think this is as light and poetic as food can get, just wait. Because next up is a casserole that is just as seasonal, but grounded in sunshine and soil. Manuman pilaf is something that's actually a traditional Native American dish centered entirely around wild rice. I know a lot of us are some genuine fans of rice, so for you guys, this will be a good one. It's something that's great as a summer or early fall dish, and it's also pretty healthy. The nutty and earthy flavor unique to wild rice is what really makes this dish stand out. It gives you a way stronger flavor than brown or white rice. It's also a lot more firm and chewy, which is great for people who don't really like their rice on the mushy side. If you parch it with fire, you can even impart a smoky undertone to it. All you need are some walnuts, maple syrup, and cranberries, and you're good to go. Wild rice is still something you can easily get from any local grocery store. Once you have everything you need, you rinse the wild rice, simmer it until it's tender, drain all the excess water, add any flavorings, and then serve it as warm as you can. This is a dish that's considered sacred in the culture of some tribes, particularly the Anishinaabe culture. It's also a great source of protein if you aren't feeling like meat this week. Gooseberry and elk were one of the most prized dishes that Native Americans would make regularly. This was because elk was one of the most treasured animals they had. In the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Plains, all sorts of tribes were known for how much they prioritized elk usage. This is because elk was something that was beneficial overall, just like deers and bison. The hides wouldn't just be used for clothing. A good quality elk hide, or one that was prized in towns like a white hide, would actually go for a fair amount of resources. They were also something that would provide meat for literally months. Even one elk was a game changer for a tribe going through tough times. They were dried for later use all the time, and the most valuable cuts were always kept for slow roasting so that they could have a great meal out of it. It was preserved for special ceremonies and hunting feasts, which would usually occur during the summer when gooseberries were also in harvest. A roasted elk haunch with some gooseberry sauce was enough food for an entire family or an entire hunting party. So, imagine what it could do for us today. Salmon candy was an incredibly unique kind of candy, and I mean that. We barely have anything that's like it in today's modern world, despite our time being dominated by processed sugars and candies. Also known as Indian candy, this was a salmon-oriented dish that would be smoked and sweetened, and the idea to mix both of those techniques together was something that the Tlingit, Haida, and Coast Salish tribes popularized. They were predominantly placed in the Pacific Northwest, and these tribes had relied on salmon for thousands of years. They had their own preservation methods as well, and smoking was one of them. It was meant to help prevent fish from going bad during long and frigid winters. So how do we go from preservation to salmon candy? It's actually a modern adaptable of the traditional smoked salmon dish, just with different kinds of sweeteners that have been incorporated. You have maple syrup, honey, and even brown sugar. At the end, you get a caramelized glaze that gives you the sugar rush you're looking for on top of a decadent, smoky, and slightly chewy salmon. Most tribes would use the salmon that were caught in the Columbia and Yukon rivers, such as Chinook, Sockeye, or Coho. Others would prioritize the kind of smoking wood used, as some believed that there were differences between alder, cedar, and fruit woods in terms of the smoky flavor they would produce. Salmon on cedar planks is not just a cooking method, it is a performance. This is how the tribes of the Pacific Northwest honored both the fish and the fire. You take a fresh-caught salmon, split and cleaned, and pin it to a cedar board with wooden skewers. Then you lean the board close to an open flame, close enough for the smoke to kiss it, but not so close that it burns. What happens next is slow alchemy. The oils from the cedar seep into the salmon, blending with the fish's natural richness and creating a flavor so bold and so smoky, it does not need seasoning at all. This dish was cooked outdoors, beside rivers, surrounded by canoes and laughter. People would gather around the fire not just for food, but for stories, for connection. When you take your first bite, you taste the water, the wood, and the flame all in one. It is elegance dressed up as campfire food. But if that was smoke and sizzle, next we are moving to something softer, something that tastes like a grandmother's whisper. Let me introduce you to a berry sauce so good it makes jam feel like an afterthought. They would be fond of using Jerusalem artichokes, squash, and wild onions as well, so stock up on your root vegetables before trying this. Corn husk-wrapped tamales have incredibly deep roots in a lot of Mesoamerican cultures. I know you might not really associate them with a lot of different ethnic groups, but it's genuinely something a lot of them have used throughout their history. There were specific tribes like the Pueblo and Hopi that had very agricultural lifestyles, and the Pueblo even had trade and cultural connections with Mesoamerican civilizations. They would share their knowledge with Mexican cultures, and in return, the Mexicans would share theirs. And that's how Native American tribes first became familiar with the idea of tamales. They were already very used to working with dried corn kernels and grounding them into masa. Also, these are a lot different from the typical tamales you might be used to because they usually rely on bison, venison, and rabbit. And each of those has its unique world of flavor different from the chicken and beef we're so used to on the corners of our streets. If you're looking for a fresh spin, try to hit up an authentic Native American joint or work with some venison or rabbit at home. You might be pretty surprised. Clay-baked fish is also something that's a bit unconventional because it doesn't really match up with anything we use today. It's a traditional cooking method that was used by several Native American tribes spread across the northern regions. A lot of places in North America were rich sources of fish, like the Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest. Back then, preserving moisture was its own separate issue and struggle, and this was a particularly widespread way of doing that. This method would help the fish retain most of its moisture while also sealing in all kinds of natural flavors, and the end result was a much more exciting dish. Now, this works with most kinds of fish, so it's not like there's some strict preference. You should just roll with what you like. If you want to be historically accurate, then the Chinook and Haida tribes were pretty fond of using salmon. Some tribes also used trout or catfish, but the idea was to prepare the entire fish while also leaving the scales intact. Why would they do this? It was all to help the fish be baked properly. You didn't want anything messing up the meat on the inside. Now, some tribes were also fond of stuffing their fish, but if that's a little much, you don't have to go the extra mile. Bison bone broth was something that wasn't just consumed by most Native American tribes, but also something they deeply cherished. See, Native Americans would go around herding their bison and traveling with them, just like family. They would provide sustenance to the community, but the animal was always incredibly well respected and taken care of. It was probably one of the most humane examples of respecting your food. Now, bison bone broth alone wasn't just something that got the people's spirits high because of some mutually shared sentiments. The bone broth itself was extremely delicious, and the bison was tenderized to the point the meat would fall off of the bone. It was honestly quite a sight, you know? It was definitely considered a superfood, and I think it really lived up to that title. Tuya, also known as Cherokee bean bread, is one of those foods that makes you feel like you are part of something older. You would start with cornmeal and mashed beans, nothing fancy, and wrap that mix tightly in corn husks or sometimes leaves, then steam it until it is soft and dense like a tamale's cousin. The best part? It only used what was already in the pantry. There was no need for sugar, yeast, or anything imported. This was made by hand, often with a fire pit outside and the whole family pitching in. It was the kind of thing you brought to a community meal, where everyone knew whose bean bread was whose. It was modest, but when done right, it had this deep, earthy flavor that did not need any butter or spread to feel complete. You would eat it hot, straight from the husk, steam still clinging to your fingers. There was no such thing as leftovers. And just like that, a humble bundle of corn and beans told the story of generations. But if you thought this was a warm hug of a dish, the next recipe is like a full-on wool blanket in the middle of winter. Acorn squash was an incredibly popular cultivated vegetable among many different kinds of tribes. Squash in itself is something the Native Americans experimented with a fair amount. All of that effort eventually brought about the Three Sisters agricultural method, which was basically just growing crops of corn, beans, and squash together. The way they grew helped the other plants grow, so they were always grown together because the end result was more fantastic than if they were grown individually. Sweetening squash with maple syrup was also something that was popular among tribes who were centered around maple syrups, and I don't know if you know this, but tapping into maple trees for the syrup was a very common practice of the Native American peoples. They were arguably better at it than anyone else too, especially because of how much they valued maple syrup as a natural sweetener. Some tribes genuinely loved to have it without the syrup, though. They would slice it and dry the squash in the sun for long-term storage. Before European contact, a lot of Native American tribes had an incredible amount of access to wild tubers and roots. This was really true for potatoes, which had been domesticated in South America. They began to replace some root vegetables as a staple crop because of the sheer amount of utility. I mean, that's a cultural fact that holds true even now. Who can really deny the worth of a potato? Some days it feels like it's worth more than all the designers in your wardrobe. Native Americans also had an incredibly interesting way of preparing these potatoes. Frying them in bear fat is definitely something I haven't really thought of before. But then again, these people used to hunt bears semi-regularly, so I think we're on pretty different ends of the spectrum. The potatoes would be sliced and fried in bear fat on a flat stone over an open fire, and it would actually make for some extremely rich and crispy potatoes. Tonka bars are a pretty modern interpretation of the original idea for pemmican. They were a traditionally high protein that was made by many tribes that were common throughout the Great Plains. Some of the most notable ones were the Lakota and Blackfoot tribes, for whom pemmican was specifically a survival food they relied on a lot. The dried bison meat, the rendered fat, and the berries would give hunters nourishment that would last several hours or days, and it was incredibly necessary to keep yourself active out in the wilds and woods. The term tonka actually came from a Lakota phrase, tatanka. This means great or big, and it is an homage to the relationship of the Lakota peoples and the bison. Tonka bars, which utilized bison meat, were hence very precious items for people who were proud of their indigenous heritage. They were developed by Native American Natural Foods, which is a company that is actively trying to revive indigenous cuisines, culinary practices, and sustainable ways of eating. Wojapi is not just a sauce, it is a revelation. Made from choke cherries, juneberries, or even wild blueberries if you had them, this thick, sweet tart dish is a staple among the Lakota and Dakota Sioux. But it is not spread thin like jam. This is served warm and ladled generously over fry bread, roasted meats, or even eaten by the spoonful. Traditionally, it was made by slowly simmering down berries with water until they broke down and thickened naturally, sweetened with just a touch of honey or maple syrup. No gelatin, no preservatives, just patience. The result? A deep, velvety berry flavor that clings to the tongue and lingers in the memory. Wajapi is the kind of thing you make in a big pot on the stove while kids are running around and elders are telling stories from the old days. It is not fancy. It is not fast. But it is unforgettable. And when you pair it with the right dish, like say a smoky slice of roasted turkey or a freshly cooked corn cake, it becomes downright transcendent. Speaking of pairing, you will want to stick around for the next one. It is a Southern comfort classic, but with a tribal twist that brings new life to breakfast. Which of these forgotten vegetables would you bring back first? Tell us below. And do not forget to subscribe for more lost stories from our roots.